Last time in this series we discussed some passages in which involuntary servitude was indicated to be forbidden, but there are a couple of passages where it seems to be permitted or even encouraged. Let's now have a look at those. The first and simpler passage we need to deal with is Exodus 22:3. I haven't seen many critics claim that this is an example of slavery, and it clearly isn't. It's a case of a criminal being held against their will in order to pay for their crimes. In that respect, it's no more slavery than it is to hold a modern prison inmate in jail. There's a second and more complex circumstance. The key passage in this regard is Deuteronomy 20, where God gives Israel instructions on how to conduct war against foreign foes. Similar provisions were made against the Gibeonites of Joshua 9, who tricked Israel into a peace treaty. Persons so captured under a flag of truce were allowed to be put under forced labor, and Egypt's captivity of Israel would have been considered to be of the same sort of servitude. But are these people slaves? There's no indication one way or another that they were considered as property. What about restrictions on their freedom? There the answer is obviously yes, they were restricted on their freedoms. But there's a caveat. Such persons are obviously kept captive not as slaves per se, but as prisoners of war. What has to be kept in mind is that in the biblical world there were no professional armies. Every man who could see, hear, and hold a spear was a member of the military. There were no civilians as such. Even women contributed to the mechanics of war as providers of support and producers of new soldiers. And even infants were seen not as civilians, but as soldiers in waiting. If you won a war against an aggressor, what could you do to keep them from rising up against you? For most nations of this period, the only real option was conscription. This is what Egypt was doing to Israel. In their view, Israel was a foreign invader within their own boundaries. The end result in the Old Testament is something more like what we call serfdom rather than slavery. The conquered peoples kept their land, but had to pay a portion of their production, sometimes in the form of labor, towards the victorious nation. Their freedom was restricted, but that was a function of their position as prisoners of war, not as serfs or slaves. There's one other passage we'll need to deal with, one so popular that this guy repeated it about 500 times in his discussion of the Bible and slavery. Since it is so popular, we'll devote a vid to that all by itself. See you next time.